Hi there, boys and girls. Today for story time, we're going to read Mr. Nosey. Now, Mr. Nosey starts with the letter N, but I bet you can find that letter O hiding in the middle. Do you see it? Mr. Nosey. Good job. This is by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Nosey liked to know about everything that was going on. He was always poking his nose into other people's business. Mr. Nosey was the kind of person who, if he came upon a locked door, couldn't resist looking through the keyhole to see why the door had been locked. Mr. Nosey was the kind of person who, if he found an unopened letter addressed to somebody else, would simply have to open it to find out what was inside. It says to Mr. Brown. Mr. Nosey was the kind of person who, if he was sitting reading his paper on a train, would much rather read the paper of the person sitting next to him. He wants to read somebody else's newspaper. Naturally, as you can imagine, Mr. Nosey was not very popular. People did not like the way in which Mr. Nosey would peek and pry into their affairs. They did not like it at all. But did that stop Mr. Nosey from peeking and prying? It did not. Mr. Nosey lived in a place called Tittletown. One day, the people of Tittletown decided that Mr. Nosey was becoming much too nosy, and so they held a meeting to discuss what to do about him. "We must find some way to stop him from being so nosy," said old Mr. Chips, the town carpenter. "That's right," said Mrs. Washer, who ran the Tittletown laundry. "He needs to be taught a lesson." "If only we could think of a way to stop him poking his nose into everything," said Mr. Brush, the painter. And then a small smile spread over his face. "Listen," he said, now grinning. "I have a plan." All his friends gathered around to listen to his plan. He has an idea to keep Mr. Nosey from being so nosy, getting into everybody's stuff. The following morning, Mr. Nosey was out walking along High Street in Tittletown when he heard somebody whistling behind one of the closed doors. "I wonder what's going on in here," he thought to himself, and he tiptoed up to the door. He quietly opened it and peeped in. Splash! Went a very wet paintbrush right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose, covering it with bright red paint. "Oh dear, I'm sorry," said Mr. Brush, who was painting on the inside of the door. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go straight home to try and remove the red paint, which was very difficult and rather painful. Mr. Brush chuckled to himself. The plan had begun. When he looked inside, poked his nose in to see what was going on behind that door, his nose got painted. Mr. Brush was painting. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking past the laundry when he heard somebody laughing on the other side of the wall. I wonder what's going on over here," he thought to himself, and standing on his tiptoe, he looked over the wall. What could be going on the other side? What are they laughing at? Snap! Went a clothespin right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. Oh, ouch. That would hurt. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said Mrs. Washer, who was hanging up clothes on the washing line on the other side of the wall. Poor Mr. Nosey removed the clothespin and went off down the street feeling extremely sorry for himself and for his poor red nose. Mrs. Washer chuckled to herself. The plan was working. The next day, Mr. Nosey was going past a fence when he heard hammering. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself, and creeping very quietly to the end of the fence, he peeked around. Do you know what might happen? Bang! Went a hammer right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. Oh dear, I'm so sorry," said old Mr. Chips, who was nailing up a loose plank onto the fence. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go home immediately and bandage his poor, red, sore nose. Mr. Chips grinned a broad grin. The plan was working very well indeed. Oh, poor Mr. Nosey. His nose was painted on, the clothespin clipped on, and now hammered. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking in the woods when he heard somebody sawing wood. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself as he crept up behind the tree. He was just about to peer out from behind the tree when it suddenly occurred to him that if he did, something very nasty might happen to his nose. Just like when he peeked around the corner, his nose got mashed and hammered. And so he went on his way without being nosy. Behind the tree, with a saw raised in his hand, stood Mr. Herd, the farmer. And when he saw that Mr. Nosey had gone on his way without being nosy, he laughed and laughed and laughed. The plan had worked. Mr. Herd hurried into Tiddletown to tell everyone. The plan had really worked because after that, Mr. Nosey stopped being nosy and soon became very good friends with everybody in Tiddletown. And that is the end of the story, except to say that if you are ever tempted to be as nosy as Mr. Nosey, as he used to be, you better expect one thing. A sore nose. The end. Mr. Nosey. I hope you enjoyed the story. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.